Greetings, everyone, and welcome back. I'm sorry we didn't have the lecture on Monday. There are some other things that came up, so I didn't present that lecture yet, and then I didn't have your notes ready for what we're going to do. Usually, I don't have time in the semester to get to all of the nitty-gritties that we're going to be doing in Chapter 27 for fluid and electrolyte and acid and base balance, so you guys are getting a treat. Yay! So I had to kind of put together those notes for this chapter, so that's what I was doing on Monday, so I wasn't able to give a live lecture then, and I just didn't have those notes ready for you posted, and I wanted to make sure that you could follow along in your notes. A couple of housekeeping things. As you all have read from the email that I sent out on Monday, on your syllabus on the 14th week, where it's dated April 27th, this says that we should have an exam 4 over electrolyte balance and reproduction. That is the exam that we're not going to have. So, and once again, all of this is stated in the email that I gave you. So you're not having that exam on April 30th. We're only going to have 3 unit exams. And when I made your syllabus, I'm not sure why I put that 4th exam on there. I guess I was just being a little overzealous, as can sometimes be the case with me. So I only need your you only have 4 exams for the semester, including the final. 3 unit exams, 1 final. They're all worth 100 points, so that the total points in the semester are going to be 740. And there are only 740 points in the semester because I drop your lowest exam grade. So I only take your 3 highest exams, whether it be your final exams 1 and 2, or whether it be exams 1, 2, and 3. If those are your 3 highest exams, those are the ones that I'm going to take. Also, our next lab practical is happening Thursday, which is tomorrow, and remember, it's only over digestive and urinary. The only histology you will be responsible for is from the digestive chapter, so don't worry about urinary histology. So the only histology will be for digestive. And as a final sort of housekeeping bit, during finals week, which will be just in a few short weeks here, it's coming up really quickly, that your final exam is going to be given in our normal laboratory classroom at your normal lab time. So if you have lab from noon till 2, then that's the time that your final will be given. If you have lab from 2 to 4, then that's when your final will be given. So your final exam will happen on a Thursday, and actually let me look here and see. Thursday, May 14th is when your final exam will be at your normally scheduled lab time. And then your final lab practical will happen on May 7th, and that's going to include reproductive anatomy and histology, as well as the rat dissection. So those will be the 2 units that are going to be covered on that. So I think that's all the housekeeping stuff that you should be aware of, other than the other email that I sent out. If you still have yet to take your Unit 3 test, you'll need to take that with me, and you'll need to schedule to take that test during my office hours. So don't come in to the biology department outside of my office hours when I'm not in the office and ask the secretary to give you the exam, because she won't have it. So you'll have to take it with me personally. And I've had a couple of students already doing that, and I think that I'm about finished. So I think with everyone, I've made arrangements with you all. So if you haven't taken the exam, you haven't made additional arrangements to take the exam personally with me, then we need to do that. But I think we're pretty good on that end. All right, so without further ado, questions, comments, or concerns before we get started? And it's probably going to take us about 3 days or so to get through this set of notes. So that this set of notes, the water and electrolyte balance, or fluid and electrolyte, and acid and base balance, will be on your final, will be new information on your final, as well as the reproductive system. Okay, and so here are some of the learning objectives, and I will post them on Blackboard if you would like me to. So we already have a pretty good understanding that water is a vitally essential compound for all of the activities that happen within your cell. In fact, 99% of your fluid outside of your cells, that extracellular fluid, is going to be water. Now we're going to be talking about extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid quite a bit in this chapter, in this discussion there. So just be familiar with those terms. That we're talking about fluid outside of the cell and fluids of the cytosol on the inside of the cell is mainly made of water. All of the operations that occur within your cell, diffusion, cellular respiration, in the hydrolysis, breaking down compounds, those macromolecules into smaller monomers and smaller subunits, all of those cellular operations rely heavily on water. It is a diffusion medium for gases to dissolve through, so gases such as carbon dioxide and oxygen, which we talked about very early in the semester. It's also a medium by which nutrients such as glucose and proteins and things of that nature are able to go in and out of the cell. Sodium ions, potassium ions, all of those different ions and nutrients and things that we've talked about as required entities for the cell are going to have to rely on water. So you should probably already by this time, after having almost an entire year of anatomy and physiology, that you understand how vital water is. Now, with the vitalness of water is equally as important, and one of the reasons why water is so important is because it helps to maintain homeostasis, that we have to maintain a normal volume and composition of both the fluid on the outside of the cell, which we call our extracellular fluid, and the fluid on the inside of your cell. So as you're reading through this chapter, you're going to see the terms of, I think they use extracellular fluid maybe one time in the first part of the chapter, and then from then on out they're just going to refer to it as the ECF or the ICF for the intracellular fluid. So your fluid balance is defined as the daily balance between the amount of water that's gained and the amount of water that's lost to the environment. In A&P1, when we went through the integumentary system, we talked about sensible and insensible perspiration. There is some small amount of water that you lose off to the atmosphere just via diffusion. So it's not that you're sweating or anything, so we call it insensible perspiration. Not that you're hot and that's why you're losing water. It's just that the water is going to diffuse off into the atmosphere. So that's some water that's going to be lost off to the environment. Through your urinary system and through your digestive system, you're going to also lose some water off to the environment. The ways in which that you gain water would be, well, you're going to gain water through ingesting foods and also through ingesting fluids as well. Your fluid balance involves regulating the amount of water that you take in and that's lost, and then distributing that water between your intracellular fluid and your extracellular fluid. Your digestive system is pretty much the primary source of your water gains, as we just talked about, because you're going to ingest it through drinking fluids and also through eating things. And then you also make a small amount from some metabolic activities that happen within the cell. So that's why your digestive system, and I'm going to highlight that, is a primary source of your water gains, whereas your urinary system, on the other hand, is the primary route for your water loss. And remember, there is some water loss in your digestive system in your fecal matter, but it's the role of your large intestine to reabsorb or reclaim water that the body needs. So that's why the digestive system doesn't have a primary role in the same way the urinary system does in the water loss, or the route for which water is lost. And whenever we talk about water, we also have to talk about electrolytes. Now, you're probably very familiar with this term because Gatorade commercials and Powerade commercials are always touting the power of electrolytes and how when you're working out and you're engaging in this really energetically expensive activity that you want to replace all those electrolytes that you've lost out of you. But I wonder how many of you all have actually thought about what electrolytes are and what is needed for electrolyte balance. I'm sure you'll find it interesting to know that the electrolytes that Gatorade and Powerade and some of those sports drinks are claiming to put back into you is actually kind of overkill, because you're not losing that many of your electrolytes out while you're doing your physical activity. There are some athletes, some elite athletes, that they may be pushing their bodies, so they are losing a few more electrolytes, but then again, even with that, you replace those electrolytes fairly quickly through your diet. So it's not like you're going to be doing your athletic event and then starving and not being able to feed yourself for the next couple of days so that you can restore those electrolytes. So in a nutshell, like I always tell my daughter, you don't need Gatorade to perform. It's a marketing ploy. So what electrolytes are is that those are ions that are released through dissociation of inorganic compounds. So some electrolytes we're going to talk about are going to be sodium, calcium, potassium. Any of those things are considered electrolytes. Electrolytes, another important feature is that they can conduct an electrical current in solution. which is vitally important for synaptic transmissions of nervous impulses. So from the neuromuscular system, we needed that electrical current to change the resting potential of the inside of the muscle cells in order to facilitate contractions. We also need electrical current to be stimulated from one neuron to the next to send and receive messages. Electrolyte balance, when the gains and losses of all electrolytes are equal, so that you're replacing what you've lost. And remember, once again, that's kind of the promotional tagline of the sports drinks, is that they are replacing the electrolytes that you lost through sweating and this energetically expensive activity because you're working so hard. But that replacement can be done through your diet. It primarily involves balancing the rates of absorption across the digestive tract because, as I said before, you can replace those electrolytes, or you do replace those electrolytes through your diet. And then you also have some electrolytes that are lost in your kidneys and in your sweat glands. So as we saw in the urinary chapter, there are some potassium ions that can be lost, some sodium ions that can be lost, and there's also some reclaiming of those things as well as we go along the length of the nephron. But we recognize that not everything gets reclaimed, not everything we have to keep. Some of it we can secrete out into the environment because we have too much of it. And for a lot of the electrolytes that we bring in from the consumption of Gatorade and other sports drinks, is that we just lose them off through our kidneys because we don't need that much electrolyte replacement. Most of us don't. In this chapter, we're also going to talk about acid and base balance, which we talked about just a little bit at the end of the urinary system. This chapter is going to have a whole section dedicated to it, so if you didn't really understand it the first time that we talked about it, then we will talk about it again, and we'll talk about compensation and what the rules are for compensation. So this you should be a little bit familiar with, that we want to, acid and base balance is balancing the production and loss of hydrogen ions, so it's keeping your pH at about what it needs to be. The body typically generates more acids during that normal metabolism, so it tends to reduce that pH. But you have bicarbonate and you have other buffers, and there are three sets of buffers, or three very specific classes of buffers that we're going to talk about in this chapter that are meant to kind of maintain that acid and base balance. If your pH gets too low, if it gets below 7.3, or if it gets too high, then it can cause physiological issues and problems with different organ systems and even failure of those organ systems. So it's important for your pH to be balanced, and we can do that through your respiratory system, helps to balance pH, as well as your digestive system and your urinary system. And we talked about those rules a little bit for compensation at the end of the urinary chapter. So some of the acid and base stuff that we go over, especially for you guys that kind of just picked it up really quickly, that's going to just be sort of review for you. So role of the kidneys. The kidneys, when we talk about electrolyte balance and water and fluid and acid and base balance, in that discussion, the role of the kidneys is that they will secrete hydrogen ions in the urine, which we are very familiar with. We talked about how we're able to do that process. Sorry about that. All right, so your kidneys, we talked about how your kidneys are going to secrete some hydrogen ions, and as a result of those hydrogen ions being in the urine, that's what gives the urine that lower pH. Your kidneys also generate buffers that enter the bloodstream, that bicarbonate, that HCO3. So HCO3, I probably shouldn't have written this in yellow highlighter. HCO3 negative is a buffer. And that buffer that's generated that we pull out of the filtrate that happens in the distal segment of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting system, that we pull this bicarbonate out. So this bicarbonate is a buffer. It's one of the three classes of buffers that we're going to talk about. You also have your lungs. The role that they play in fluid, electrolyte, and acid and base balance is that they're able to affect the pH by getting rid of carbon dioxide. And that we talked about a little bit at the tail end of the urinary when we talked about respiratory compensation. So remember, that concept we're going to come back to because we kind of hit on acid and base balance just a little teeny tiny bit. So in maintaining electrolyte balance, which remember, basically, the amount of electrolytes that you bring in roughly is going to equal the amount of electrolytes that you lose through urination, defecation, and sweating, most notably urination and sweating on there. We have a couple of rules for electrolyte balance that I want you to be familiar with. Usually the biggest problems with electrolyte balance is that there's an imbalance between the gain and the losses of those sodium ions. Now, to be honest with you, most folks in our society have a very, the problem with sodium ions is not that they lose too much of them, it's that we have too much of them, that we are gaining and put way too many sodium ions into our body. Going back to that Gatorade and Powerade discussion that we just had there, that when you consume those drinks, those products, it's saying that it's replacing the electrolytes that you've lost. Well, sodium is one of the electrolytes that it's attempting to replace, but we have so much sodium that we ingest through our normal diets, especially in our society, that we'll have too much of it. We don't need as much of it. So that's usually the biggest problem. In our country, specifically, it's having too much sodium. Having problems with potassium is a little less common, but if you have potassium imbalances, they are going to be a lot more dangerous than if we have sodium imbalances. Sodium imbalances are going to definitely sodium imbalances are definitely going to have an effect, but there's going to be a greater effect with potassium ions. It's going to give you issues with your heart and with your muscles. So potassium imbalance, having too much potassium in your body, is definitely a much bigger and more dangerous issue. And it's actually called hyperkalemia. So hyperkalemia is having too much potassium in your body. Some of the things that can happen with that is that if you have more than that, then your kidneys could fail, or you can have tingling in your extremities, weakness, issues with your heart, abnormal heart rate. So too much potassium is much more problematic than too much sodium. Sodium balance. Total amount of sodium in your extracellular fluid represents a balance between two different factors: how much sodium you uptake in your digestive system and how much you excrete in your urine and in your perspiration. Thank you. And that we've kind of, already talked about where we're getting these electrolytes from. We get them primarily from the foods that we eat and the things that we ingest. How do we lose them? Well, we usually lose them in our secretions. And big fluidy secretion that you're always leaking out of your body is urine, and another fluidy secretion is through your perspiration. Now, to regulate those normal sodium ion concentrations, we have some players here that we've already talked about. So let's pull out the old pointer. So normal sodium concentration in your extracellular fluid. If that homeostasis is disturbed, and let's say that it is disturbed because we have an increased amount of sodium in our extracellular fluid, then your osmolar receptors in your brain are going to be stimulated to release antidiuretic hormone. The antidiuretic hormone restricts water loss, stimulates thirst, and promotes additional consumption of water. All of the things that we talked about antidiuretic hormone doing in the endocrine chapter, as well as all the things we talked about antidiuretic hormone doing in the urinary chapter, that this hormone, when it's released, when it's stimulated, and now we're talking about specifically what is one thing that can help stimulate this, the release of this hormone, which is that there's too much sodium in the extracellular fluid. That those receptors in the brain are going to recognize that there's a higher concentration of solute than there is for solvent, so it's going to be stimulated. The hypothalamus will send a message to the pituitary gland to release antidiuretic hormone. So because we've released this antidiuretic hormone, remember we're reclaiming more water at your distal convoluted tubule and as well as at your ascending loop of Henle. We're retaining more water. We're also stimulating more thirst so that you'll crave and want more water and promote more water consumption. Because we've done that, we've recalled more fluids, brought more water in, retained more water at our kidneys, as a result of the antidiuretic hormone. As a result of this, osmoregularity increases, water shifts out of the intracellular fluid, the fluid that's on the inside of those cells, and it increases the extracellular fluid of water. And by doing that, we're now having a greater concentration of solvents to solute. So that's going to bring that concentration of solutes or sodium ions down. So at that point, homeostasis is restored. So we decrease the amount of sodium ions in the extracellular fluid. Let's say it's an issue where we have the decreased levels of sodium ions. So we're at homeostasis, and then for some reason or another, there's not enough sodium ions in the extracellular fluid. Once again, the osmoregulators in the hypothalamus are going to detect this, and because they have detected this, instead of promoting the release of antidiuretic hormone, look what happens. Osmoreceptors in hypothalamus are inhibited, and antidiuretic hormone secretion decreases. So as soon as the osmotic concentrations of extracellular fluid drops by even just 2%, your body will stop producing or secreting antidiuretic hormone, so that you don't have this thirst, you don't have this thirst that's happening. Water loss is going to be permitted at the kidneys, and you're going to release more of this water. So you're going to have larger volumes of very dilute urine. The water loss reduces, it's lower volumes of very concentrated urine. Water loss reduces, extracellular volume increases. The extracellular volume, water loss reduces extracellular volume, and then the concentration of the ion, of the sodium ion, is going to increase, so that we have an overall increase in extracellular fluid. Take-home message from both of these is that when there is an imbalance in your sodium ions, what needs to take place is that there's going to be the hypothalamus will either secrete antidiuretic hormone more, or will reduce the secretion of antidiuretic hormone. Well, how do we decide which one's going to happen? If it is the case that you have too many sodium ions, then we're going to increase the amount of antidiuretic hormone that's released. If it is the case that you don't have enough sodium ions, then we're going to decrease antidiuretic hormone secretion. So let's highlight those things on this slide and on the previous slide. Increase, increase. Hyponatremia is when your body water content rises. You have overhydration that takes place. Your extracellular fluid sodium concentrations are very, very high. So hyponatremia is an over-dehydration. This would be the slide that we just looked at, where we had sodium ions were declined. So we had a low concentration of sodium ions, and we have a very high, much higher than normal concentration of water. We don't have enough of that particular electrolyte. A really interesting story on overhydration, and actually there are a couple of interesting stories. There was a lady that held her wee for a wee. It was a radio contest, and some of you guys have probably even heard me talk about this before. There was a radio contest where the people were supposed to hold their wee, their pee, in order to win a the Wii. And this is when they first came out, so it was a couple of years ago. I think it was in '07 sometime, or maybe a little bit earlier than that. But it was when the Wiis first came out, the Nintendo Wiis, which is a game playing system thingy. I'm sure I'm not saying it politically correct. There was this game playing system that they were very difficult to get a hold of. So there was a radio contest, and there was a mother who was trying to win this Wii for her children. So she participated in this contest, and she actually died of water intoxication. So I just found we're going to take a little bit of a field trip, and we'll talk about, we'll look at this story. And hopefully it'll allow us to play the video. So, and part of holding your wheat is that you had to consume lots and lots and lots of water. So what actually happened is that she died as a result of water intoxication, or she was very, very much overhydrated. Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought you all could hear what was going on. That really sucked. So I'm gonna post this on Blackboard because I thought you all could hear it, and apparently you could not. Okay, thank you for letting me know that you couldn't hear anything, Crystal. I'm so sorry. All right, that was a total waste of time. That was an epic failure. Okay. All right, I don't even know what to do with my life right now. Okay, so basically what they were talking about is that this lady died as a result of hyponatremia, where she ingested way too much water, which is a medical term for water intoxication. She was overhydrated. Usually hyponatremia, we see that as a problem when people have issues with their kidneys, but she was a perfectly healthy woman, and she just continued to consume and drink more water in order to win this gaming system. So I'm going to post the link to that story into Blackboard, and then you will have sound to listen to it. And I just feel like a complete fool right now because we just sat there like through 3 minutes of silence. At least you guys did, and I am just, okay, sorry. All right. The opposite of that, hypernatremia, is where you have your body water content decline, so you have a higher concentration of those sodium ions, and that is a hallmark of dehydration. And I think you all are pretty familiar with that. I feel like such a boob. All right. So since we're talking about an extracellular fluid and intracellular fluid, we have to talk about plasma volume, because most of your plasma is composed of water. If your plasma volume is too large, so if your plasma volume is too large, we're going to go back here, we have this overhydration, maybe not hyponatremia in the extent that it's going to kill you, but if we have a large amount of plasma, then something we talked about already in the circulatory system, the amount of venous return is going to increase the release of natriuretic peptides, both atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide. One of the jobs that they do is to reduce thirst. Well, why do we want to reduce thirst? Well, we don't want to bring in any more water because we have more than enough water. The plasma volume is way too large. It's also going to block and help to reduce the amount of secretion of antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. Aldosterone's job is to reclaim salts, and salt follows water. That's a good old way to remember that. Salt is going to follow water. Or water follows salt. Sorry, I said it backwards. So a good way to remember that where the salt goes, the water is going to follow. So if we have aldosterone, who's meant to reclaim sodium and chloride ions, then water is going to also be reclaimed as well. So if we have too much fluid in the body, then we want to reduce some of that fluid. What these natriuretic peptides do is will reduce thirst, so you don't consume anymore. It will also block the antidiuretic hormone so we don't retain any more, and block aldosterone so we don't retain any more sodium chloride and water. So salt and water loss at your kidneys is going to, on the other hand, increase. And as these things happen, under the control of atrial natriuretic peptide and brain natriuretic peptide, the amount of extracellular volume is also going to decline. Having a volume that's too high can give us a really, really high blood pressure that we don't need, and that can be problematic for a host of reasons, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So here's a handy-dandy picture, another picture showing kind of what we just talked about. We have normal extracellular fluid volume. If we have too much of that, it rises. The rising extracellular fluid volume by fluid gain or fluid and a sodium ion concentration gains means that we're going to have increased blood volume, and the atria of the heart are going to distend. As a result of that distension, the natriuretic peptides are going to be released by your muscle cells. When they are released, we're going to increase sodium loss to the urine. We want to get rid of some of that sodium. And remember, wherever the salt goes, water is going to follow it. We're going to increase water loss in the urine as well, so you're going to have more of this water that's going to be lost to your urine, pretty much as a result of the increased sodium ion loss. The amount of thirst is going to be reduced, so you don't intake as much fluid. We're also going to inhibit antidiuretic hormone from working, so we're not going to reclaim as much fluid from the filtrate in the kidneys and those nephrons. Aldosterone is not going to reclaim as many sodium ions, and epinephrine and norepinephrine release are also going to be inhibited as well. So from all of these things happening as a result of these natriuretic peptides is that we're going to reduce our blood volume, and if we reduce the blood volume, we're also going to reduce the blood pressure, and we are restored back to homeostasis. And once again, conversely, if we have a falling extracellular fluid volume and losing too many sodium ions as well, then our blood pressure and volume is going to be decreased. So what the response is here is that, look, we're not talking about those natriuretic peptides anymore. We're going to be talking about another hormone, which is renin. So renin secretion and angiotensin II are going to be secreted, which will further enhance or promote the secretion of aldosterone and antidiuretic hormones, so that we reclaim more water, we reclaim more sodium and chloride ions, so that we can reclaim more water as well in order to increase the amount of sodium ions that are retained in the urine. That's the job of aldosterone. It also is going to decrease how much water is lost in the urine, increases your thirst, and definitely will increase your water uptake, so that these combined effects will then increase your extracellular fluid of your cells and increase the volume in your plasma. So So that was all on just sodium balance. Looking at potassium balance, 90% of the potassium in your body is in the inside of your cells, in your intracellular fluid. If you go back to the nervous system, we talked about how sodium and potassium are very important in synaptic transmissions for your nerves, and that when we're trying to repolarize a cell, trying to get it back to resting potential, it involves the movement of sodium ions outside of the cells. The cells expend energy to recover potassium ions, and they expend energy through the sodium-potassium pump, where we want to bring in, we kick out 3 sodium ions to bring in 2 potassium ions. The process of potassium balance, the rate of gain across the digestive epithelium and the rate of loss into the urine, those are the 2 primary places where we're gaining potassium ions, definitely through your digestive system, through the consumption of things that have potassium in them, and then we lose some of those potassium ions in the urine, and we talked about that in the urinary system. So speaking of the urinary system, factors in tubal secretion of potassium ions. So if there are changes in pH, depending on what the aldosterone levels are, and definitely changes in the potassium concentration of extracellular fluid, then that's going to determine how much potassium is released by the body, that's put into the secretions that becomes your urine. Aldosterone levels affect potassium loss in the urine. There are ion pumps that reabsorb sodium from the filtrate in exchange for potassium. So the sodium-potassium pump is in part activated by the hormone aldosterone. So lots of potassium in the plasma are going to stimulate the production of aldosterone, and when that's been stimulated, we're going to reclaim or retain more of those sodium ions, and then we kick them out in exchange for potassium. So we want to keep the sodium, but we're going to kick out the potassium. Now for calcium balance. Calcium, we saw quite a few uses for calcium. We saw it for increasing the refractive phase in cardiac muscles. We saw calcium be important for skeletal muscle contraction. We saw calcium being important for the exocytosis of neurotransmitters. We also saw calcium being important as a second messenger in the endocrine system. So calcium has a huge job in the body. Calcium, of the ions that we've talked about, or actually of the minerals that we have talked about, went the wrong way, is the most abundant mineral in the body. And then we also have calcium that's stored in your skeleton. So 99% of your calcium is deposited into your skeletal system. Hypercalcemia exists if you have way too much calcium. It's usually caused by hyperparathyroidism, so that you are secreting too much of this hormone called parathyroid hormone. And remember, parathyroid hormone is responsible for the absorption of calcium, of keeping calcium. Other causes of hypercalcemia may be tumors. One of the tests, if they look and see your calcium levels are abnormally high, and then you also may, if you have a small mass or a lump, that in conjunction are also ways to detect whether or not maybe possibly you were dealing with some sort of cancer, especially early on before we had this litany of tests that we have now. Excessive calcium or vitamin D supplementation, so if you're taking vitamins or nutrients or something of that nature and you're taking too much of that, then you will have an excess amount of calcium. Or even if you have too much of a vitamin D supplement, then that can also cause hypercalcemia. Hypocalcemia is the opposite. That means your calcium levels are too low. It's much less common than hypercalcemia, and it's usually caused by kidney failure. So chronic renal failure is usually what causes this. It may be caused by hypoparathyroidism, which means that instead of secreting the normal amount of parathyroid hormone that helps to retain some of those calcium ions and not secreting too much of it, which we had for hypercalcemia, we have an undersecretion of it. And in conjunction with this, it may also be caused by having a vitamin D deficiency. And then the last one we're going to talk about today is magnesium balance. Magnesium is not quite the rock star that like sodium and potassium and calcium are, but it's still a very vital electrolyte that's needed in your bone. 60% of your magnesium that you consume in your diet is going to be deposited into your skeleton. It is a very important cofactor for different enzymatic reactions, specifically to phosphorylate or to put phosphate groups on glucose, which we will then harvest and get energy out of it. And then we use magnesium for the ATP that's used by the contracting muscle fibers really relies on that phosphorylation of glucose to take place. So magnesium being a cofactor to help with that is also very important. We reabsorb a lot of magnesium that would normally be kicked out as part of the filtrate in the proximal convoluted tubule. So very early on in that process of filtration and reabsorption in the nephron of your kidney, we're absorbing more of this magnesium. So it hasn't had, like I said, it's a huge, bigger role as we saw for some of the other electrolytes, but it's still pretty important. I guess we'll go ahead and, all right, so let's go ahead and finish out the rest of these electrolytes, and then we'll start up with acid-base balance. So phosphate ions required for bone mineralization, which we talked about because we had the calcium phosphate in the skeletal system. We lose a good chunk of phosphate, or just a good chunk, but phosphate is lost in your fecal matter as well as in your urinary. Your urine, you're going to lose some of that. Phosphate, PO4 3- is reabsorbed in your proximal convoluted tubule, much the same way as magnesium. So once again, pretty early on in that process of filtration and reabsorption in your nephron, we will be reclaiming those phosphate ions. Not only do we need phosphate ions for bone mineralization, we need phosphate ions to make energy or ATP. We need phosphate ions for our nucleic acids. So the sugar phosphate backbone of your DNA consists of this same phosphate ion for many enzymatic activities you require. So right here where it says, on the inside of your cells, phosphate is required for ATP compounds or UTP, those high energy compounds, to turn on different enzymes, to make nucleic acids. We require this phosphate. So phosphate you've probably talked about or are familiar with a little bit more than the role of magnesium, but they're both equally important. And I'm not so concerned with you remembering what the concentration, the daily concentration is of phosphate ions. Chloride ions are the most abundant anions in the extracellular fluid because when we talked about sodium ions and potassium ions and hydrogen ions, all of those ions are positively charged. So chloride ions, which are negatively charged, they're the most abundant anion. On the inside of your cells, the concentration of chloride ions is usually pretty low. We don't have a super huge amount of them. The way that we're able to get them into our body is that we will absorb them across the digestive tract, and typically chloride ions will come along with sodium ions, and they usually come along together as sodium chloride or salts that we have them coming along together. Those chloride ions are reabsorbed with sodium by carrier proteins in your renal tubules, so in your nephron tubules, where, remember we talked about how aldosterone is a hormone that will reclaim sodium ions. It also reclaims those chloride ions as well, so there's different carrier proteins that are in that nephron tube, particularly in the ascending loop or the ascending limb of the nephron tube. We're reclaiming some of those chloride ions. And usually for chloride ions, a good job, or what we've talked about using them for is the alkali tide that we saw chloride ions being used in the digestive system. All right, so that is where we will finish for the day. On Monday, we will talk acid-base balance and just see how far we get through our notes then. Questions, comments, concerns, and I am so sorry, guys, that you did not hear the stupid video. It was a really good one. But I will post it on Blackboard so that you guys can see it. Crystal asked a fantastic question. Will the final be the same format as the other test? Final will be a little bit different. No short answer, no fill in the blank, all multiple choice. The final will consist of questions that will be just used up a little bit. They're going to be changed a little bit from what you had on your previous test, in addition to the stuff that we're talking about now. So for the fluid, electrolyte, and water balance, as well as the reproductive, that's all going to be on the final as well. But it will be 50 multiple choice questions. No short answer, no fill in the blank. There's going to be probably about half and half. So it'll be half and half of the new stuff. Good question. So it'll be half old stuff, half new stuff. You are so very welcome. Thank you for asking really good questions, because some of these things I forget about. Thank you, Caroline. And I will see you guys. Caroline, I'll see you in like a couple of hours. And for Crystal, I will see you tomorrow.